Recording in progress.
All righty. Well, let's go ahead and continue. All right. So good morning. Happy Friday. Last couple of days before the end of January into February. So we're going to be discussing today the California Residential Purchase Agreement, better known as the RPA. You want to make sure that you're using the most current, revised, updated forms when you go into your California Association of Realtors, or if you're using your desktop, make sure that it's updated as well, because you don't want to have an older version. Now, this is going to be rapid fire form, but it also, technically, this is a form that I can literally spend maybe 2.5 to 3 hours dissecting verbatim all of the details on this purchase agreement. Now, this is to me, in my opinion, the heartbeat of what we do in our careers, right? Is the real estate negotiations, real estate deals put together. These are what creates open escrows and the ability for us to, purchase a property, sell a property, invest in a property, and so on and so forth. Most of it is pretty self-explanatory, right? And really the essence is what I recommend, and this is something that I really truly state to everyone that I talk to, is get in the habit of having a copy of a fully executed form, meaning it's completely filled out. That way you can use it as a reference. So next time when you're ready to submit an offer, you at least know that you have something that you can use as a guide. Okay. And back in the days, we didn't have the technology to, use computers to fill this out. We used to do them by handwriting. We would add the dates, we would add the names, we would add the address, the county, the APN number, the brokerages. When I started my real estate career back in the mid 90s, I think there was only like six pages to the purchase agreement. 6 pages. Now I think we have a gazillion different forms here, which it wouldn't surprise me that 5 years from now, 10 years, it's going to be over 40 documents, with all of the advisories and disclosures that are attached to it. But the meat and potato is this form. We also have a commercial purchase agreement, a vacant purchase agreement. We also have a residential income purchase agreement. But this one is up to, a condo, townhome, manufactured home, single family residence. You can use this form even with multifamily if you want to, but I wouldn't encourage it. I would rather use the RIPA form, the RIPA form, because when you deal with multifamily, now it has languages and paragraphs that talks about, tenants and leases and all that fun stuff. So the essence is, good morning. The essence is you want to make sure you use the appropriate document. This, again, single family condos, townhomes, manufactured home is the ideal form to utilize. Now, we're going to play different segments here, right? We're going to talk a little bit about you as the buyer's agent, and we're going to also talk a little bit about you as the listing agent, right? Because the beautiful thing is, if you have a listing, you want to get offers. And when you're the buyer's agent, you want to submit offers and get your offer accepted, right? So the essence is, think of this form as a book. You're reading a book from page one all the way to the end of the book, right? And it gives you concise understanding and instructions. Now, this document is here to protect everyone. It protects the agents involved. It protects the principals involved, the buyer and the seller. It protects the escrow. It protects the title companies. It protects third-party vendors because we're not experts, right? We don't practice law. We don't practice any type of accounting or taxation or give any type of advice. But we are licensed real estate professionals in the capacity to provide a specific understanding of the initial process from A to Z. Okay. And I'll explain how you navigate the conversations when you're having a sit down with the buyer, especially if it's a new buyer, right? The uncertainty, right? When a first time home buyer is like, one, am I going to lose my deposit? Right? That's usually the first things that we hear is that if I'm going to submit an offer, but I don't like the property or the property has a lot of issues, am I forfeiting my deposit? The answer, it really depends. It depends on how the offer was drafted and how the terms and condition of this form was signed and executed, right? So in essence, yeah, there may be some type of liability that you may forfeit your earnest deposit, right? But also there's a layer of protection that protects the consumer when it comes to the process. So we'll dive into it and give you clarity on how these forms work. Okay. And again, if you have any questions, please let me know. For the people here in class, raise your hand. For the people on Zoom, just say, hey, Simon, I have a question. I'll be checking and monitoring my messages as well on Zoom. So if you have any questions. And again, I appreciate you all jumping on the call. Again, this is the most vital form, in my opinion, that gives us the momentum and the understanding. Once this offer is executed, you have a binding agreement. So let's go right into it. California Residential and Purchase Agreement and Joint Escrow. So a lot of question is, why does it say joint escrow instructions? So I want to nip it in the rear and explain why it says joint escrow. So this document mirrors the instructions that an escrow company. That's why they combine the purchase agreement and the joint, meaning the marriage, the merger of the escrow instructions. So everything that's on here is going to duplicate and mirror with the escrow instructions. So basically, it's hand on hand, if that's put some clarity, right? So that's the reason you have this information. The first is the date of preparation. Okay, what does that mean? That means is the date that you started this document, not the initial signatures, but when you started this form, right? It could be today, but you're not going to get it completely done till tomorrow or in 2 days. The date of preparation is the date that the document started, when you created this file. Number one goes into the offer. Okay, what is the offer? Well, the offer is from who? Well, it's from the consumer, the buyer. So you're going to put who the buyers are. If it's one buyer, if it's multiple buyers, you're going to put all of their information, right? Now the question is, how do I know what buyer to put? Well, if they're getting qualified for a loan, and if it's one party, you're just going to put one party. If it's two people, then you're going to put two people. Now, if one is not qualifying for the loan but wants to be added to title, okay, then it may depend. This is a question you're going to check with the lender to find out, can we put this second person on the offer, or would that delay the process where down the line we have to remove that person and then eventually add her or him into title on a future date? Okay. So for the sake of today, you're putting the names of the buyers that are purchasing the property. The property to be acquired, very self-explanatory, right? It's the address. Okay, make sure that if you're looking at the MLS information, it coincides with the information. If it says 123 ABC Street, um, or road or avenue or boulevard, make sure it references it all. Double check, triple check, so make sure that it coincides, because one little mistake, one little error can definitely alter this and delay the process in the back end, right? The city I just used as an example, the city of Redondo Beach, county, that's the county of where the property is located, and then the zip code. Okay. The next is what we call the assessor's parcel, better known as the tax ID. This is the social security to the property. Okay. This is how the county assesses and ultimately evaluates property taxes. So this is an important element to the form is that it has to show the entity of the property. So you want to reference, double check, triple check to make sure that the APN number references the subject property. If the APN number does not coincide with the actual address, then something is off. The address is off or your APN number is off. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions so far? All right. So postal mailing address may be different from a city jurisdiction. Buyer is advised to investigate, right? And the reason I say this is one of the elements that we see a lot of issues is the property is in a PO box neighborhood, meaning it's not part of a city, right? It may be incorporated into a county. The best way that you'll know is if it's a city agency, you'll see like the city fire department and the city police department. If it's an incorporate part, then you'll see the county, right? The county fire and the county of Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, right? Even though it has a PO box like Torrance, right? Because Torrance has many different sections, but there is a section that is patrolled by Torrance PD, but there's also a section in Torrance that is patrolled by LAPD. Okay. So they don't cross merge to one another. It's a jurisdiction. So the bold information here is make sure that your clients are aware because there may be a difference between school district. They're thinking Torrance, but they're thinking this school district, but in essence, it may be LA Unified School District. So you got to be very careful in how you navigate the conversation. And obviously, your clients need to do their due diligence as well, too, as well. But you got to be proactive in it to maintain the integrity of the situation because you don't want to be in a deal falls out of escrow because they thought they were part of the Torrance Unified School District, right? So do your homework, make sure you do your research before you show any properties. All right, number two goes into the agency, right? These are full disclosures that the parties acknowledge that there's agents, professional licensed real estate granted permission by the state of California to conduct real estate activities and get compensated for services rendered. So in essence, this segment is an important element so that way escrow and all parties know who is involved in this transaction. For the sake of today, the confirmation, the seller's brokerage, that means the listing agent's information. Okay. The listing agent's information. So therefore, you're going to put the listing company or listing broker, right? If it's ABC Realty, you're going to put ABC Realty. You find all of that information through the multiple listing service. Then you're going to put the corporate license number of the company. You can research through the MLS, it'll have that information, or you can go through the Department of Real Estate, type in that specific license number, and it'll populate the information that you want, or even the listing agent's ID. It'll coincide on which company the agent works for. The next section is the listing agent's name. Okay, so you're going to put the agent's name. If it's Tom Jones, you're going to put Tom Jones. If it's Rebecca Smith, you're going to put Rebecca Smith. You're also going to put her or his license year as well to reference that she is the one representing the seller. The buyer section, pretty self-explanatory. I just use Keller Williams South Bay as the hub, but it depends on what brokerage you belong. You're going to put the name of the broker, the license number, and the name of the agent who is representing the buyer. Now, you also want to make sure that you check these boxes to know and identify who is representing who. In this case, the seller is being represented by the listing broker, and the buyer is being represented by Keller Williams. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, cool. All right, next goes into section C. It's already defaulted in there, right? Because one, we already know that there's two brokerages involved in this transaction. So at default section C, more than one brokerage represents, right? So meaning that we don't have to attach the ABA form. That's usually if the listing agent has another co-listing agent or the buyer's agent has another agent also involved in the process of helping that buyer. then you would include that as part of the process. Section D goes into the potential competing buyers and sellers. All right. So it's already defaulted in this check. If you see where it says possible representation of more than one buyer and seller disclosure. What this means, folks, is this form is full disclosure, transparency. What does that mean? It means that can an agent represent multiple buyers and submit offers to the same property? Say yes, Simon. Yeah, you can. You can represent multiple buyers and submit offers to the same property as long as you have the PRBS form. Okay. That form is the disclosures that tells the consumer, hey, just for your knowledge, uh, your agent, Simon, may be representing another buyer who may be submitting an offer on the same property, right? And we don't commingle or exchange information. You cannot, or the consumer cannot ask, hey, you're representing Tom Jones over here. What offer did you submit? You don't divulge that. It's separate. Even though you represent two parties or even three parties, you don't divulge that information. Remember, at the end of the day, you're taking care of your client's best interest. So you don't divulge that information, right? But you have to disclose that if you are representing someone else and someone tells you directly, hey, are you representing someone else? The answer is yes, I am. Okay. But you don't have to go into the details of what price, terms, and condition. That is confidential information, right? So all you can do is, I'm sorry, I cannot divulge that information. It's confidential, but I can say that in talking to the listing agent, this is where, they're talking about where we should be. Okay. Which has nothing to do with the buyer and the conversation I'm having with another buyer. Does that make sense? Okay. So in essence, please look at how you look at this in the essence, because I think it's very, very important that you know how to navigate that when you have multiple buyers involved. All right, now we get into the meat and potato, what we call the grid of the form, right? This is the terms of the purchase agreement and the allocation of costs. This is what now, maybe 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, when they created this form, they included what's called the grid. This is the grid here, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, everything that's in those boxes is now called the grid. I personally like this is because it makes it so much easier to reference where in the past in old forms it was hard. You had to go page by page and see, okay, what is this? What is that? They simplify this by including the grid. Okay. So it talks about letters on the left, paragraphs title, terms and conditions, and additional terms. Okay. So the first is the most important is what is the buyer willing to submit an offer, right? I used 1,150,000 as a sample, right? It's all based on what the property is going for, right? You look at the MLS, it may be 1 million, it may be 800, it may be $2 million. But for the sake of today's class, I'm using 1,150,000. If the property is a cash deal, meaning the buyer's going to go all cash, no traditional financing, then you would check all cash. But in this case, we are going with traditional financing. Okay. Section B talks about the close of escrow, better known as the COE, close of escrow. Typical close of escrow is 30 days. Now, who is the best person to get that information?
Escrow.
Oh,
Under the agent, buyer's agent,
no, no.
fake seller.
Yes, the lender. The lender is the one that is going to give us the green thumb or not the green thumb when it comes to how fast can they get the loan, because in a traditional loan, we're on the mercy of the lender. And if the lender's on top of it, we can close in less than 30 days. So the essence is when you're having a conversation with the buyer and they're going through the motions of getting pre-qualified, you want to make sure that you're having conversations with the lender. Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Lender, what do you think we can get this deal done and close? You know what? We should do 30 days, but I think I could close it in 20 or 25 days. Fantastic. Buff it up. and say we want 30 days, because you may need that extra buffer of time because unexpected situations. There's always going to be something that may happen where it delays from the original close of escrow. What we're just doing, we're just painting the picture to the listing agent and the buyer. Hey, here are the terms that the buyers are willing to go in to submit an offer, right? But all of this is all subject to change, right? But we're just starting the basis of the negotiations and terms and condition. I can submit this to the listing agent. Doesn't mean that the listing agent is going to accept this, or the seller, I should say. They may come back with a counter, back and forth, right? It's like playing tennis, right? Back and forth until we have mutual agreement. Then we start what's called open escrow. Okay. All right. Section C talks about expiration of offer. Okay. Now, the beautiful thing is, if you look just between expiration of offer and the letter C, it has a letter and a number. You see that? 32A. Okay. 32A is the reference paragraph that, if you want to get a little bit more clarity of what an expiration of offer, go to paragraph 32A, and it's going to give the answer to you and your clients. It's already defaulted at 3 calendar days. What does that mean? Calendar days versus business days. Anyone? What's the difference between calendar days and business days?
Yeah.
Yeah. Calendar days is 1, 2, 3. Business days is typically Monday through Friday. Yeah. So when you see calendar days, that means it's 1, 2, 3. So even if it's Saturday, it's considered 3 days, right? So that's the difference. And you got to look out for those little hidden stuff, because there's a lot of agents that have a misconception and misunderstanding is, well, it should be 3 business days. No, I stand corrected. No, it's not. It's 3 calendar days for the expiration of this offer. Meaning that if you submit this offer and the seller does not acknowledge this offer to the 4th day, it's an expired offer. Does that make sense? So you want to calculate how that works. Now, the beautiful thing is you can modify this. It doesn't have to be 3 days. You can push it by just adding the days that you want. Okay. So you can do, instead of 3 calendar days, I need till February 5th to do that, right? That's how that works. Now, it already defaults to that this offer will expire at what time? I have my hands up.
5
p.m.
So I'm giving hot fives. 5 o'clock, guys. Yeah, 5 o'clock. So at 5 p.m., this offer is basically void or expired. Okay. Now, that also gives you an opportunity to modify it too. You can push the time from 5 to 6 to 7 p.m., or you can subtract and say, I need to get an answer no later than 11 o'clock in the morning. Okay, so you have that option. And again, it's all dialogue and conversations with your clients. All right, the next is the initial deposit. Okay, the initial deposit is the amount that the buyer is willing to risk. And I'm going to say that in sincerity, because the deposit is good faith money holding on to a specific property. Well, Simon, what do you mean by that? Okay, it's very simple. If you're going to hold a property for 30 days, you need to have some skin in the game. No seller should ever entertain an offer without any security, and more so a deposit, right? Because if there's damage and there's no money, the seller's out. You cannot unilaterally go after compensation once this form is executed. Does that make sense? So, in essence, you want to make sure that you have a clear, concise conversation with the buyer and explain to the buyer, listen, this is just part of the process. We need to put some type of deposit in order for us to be considered. Because if there is multiple offers and you have 0 or very low amount, okay, that's going to be a problem. They may not accept our offer. They may not consider our offer, or they may counter us to include. Now, the basis of this class is that the most that a seller can get on damages and breach of contract is up to 3% if it's owner occupied. Okay, you're buying this for the intent to own it, right? And owner occupied. So that's the maximum that the seller can go after for damages if the buyer defaults on this contract. Okay. So I just put 34,500. How did I get that? Well, I just did 1,150,000 times 3%, and it gave me 34,500. And then that's typically the maximum amount that the seller. Now, the buyer can put more. The buyer can put less. Okay. So I want to be clear, this is not set in stone. Okay. It's really what your buyer feels comfortable losing. In essence, if they defaulted, right? Now, there's still, remember, a layer of protection when it comes to this form, right? So it's not like they're going to lose their money. There still has to be a mutual agreement. And if there's not a meeting of the mind and no mutual understanding, well, the money stays in escrow. That's why escrow is called a third party neutral party. Okay. Right. Just on the right side, it talks within 3 business days. Now it says business days, not calendar days, right? So now with 3 business days, and I modified and I said within 2 business days after acceptance, the buyer will wire the transfer, meaning that within 2 business days, I will have the buyer's money in escrow. Once I know the escrow company, the escrow officer, and then the instructions of the wire, okay? Then the buyer will get that information, confirm, call the escrow company, and make sure to verify the account because we don't want that money to go somewhere else. 34,500 is a lot of money. With fraud happening right now, it's very, very vital, right? Especially if you've been compromised. Your email has been compromised and it looks like it's coming from you, but it's not you. Someone compromised and hacked into your computer, and it's now having dialogue with your buyer. And then they say, don't send it here, right? And the escrow company never receives the money. So you got to be very careful. This is why you want to double check and triple check that they stay in communications. Pick up the phone, and when you're having the conversation with the buyer, say, hey, before you wire any money, make sure you call the escrow company to confirm the account and routing information. Okay. All right, let's continue. Section D talks about the increase of deposit. This is only if the buyer is willing to put more more deposit. Now, this is an instance, for example, folks, when let's say you put a very low deposit, $5,000, right? But it's because the buyer doesn't have the means because they're waiting to sell their own property. And they're waiting for the proceeds of the sale of their home, right? In order for them to now have the money to, one, put a large down payment or cash, but also put an additional deposit. Okay, so now you have that option to do increased deposit. Make sense? All right. Now let's get into section E1 that talks about the loan amount. Okay. And this is where a lot of agents get a little bit confused on how this works. It's all arithmetic, it's all math here. Okay. But it's simple math. It's not calculus, it's nothing super, super complex. It's just simple math, folks. Okay. So, how do you get the loan amount? Okay. Well, many variables, but the simplest way to explain this is depending on how much of a down payment they're putting. If they're putting 3.5% as an FHA, if they're putting 0% down because it's in a VA, if it's 10, 5, 20% or more, then that's how you calculate the math on it. So all you have to do is base the purchase price times 20% will give you the loan amount, or times 80% will give you the down payment amount. And if you do it times 80%, it'll give you the loan amount. And in this case, the loan amount is 920,000. That's what they're going to borrow from the bank. Okay. And that is all subject to change. I get a lot of agents that says, well, what about the closing costs and all of the additional prorated stuff that we need. Don't worry about that. Okay. You just think of it as simplistic as you possibly can. They will modify, they will adjust, as we get closer to closing, the lender and the escrow company will be in communications to iron all of the amounts necessary that the buyer has to bring to the table. Everything is estimated. Right now, we just focus on the price and the down payment. That's all you need to worry about. Okay. Don't get too entangled on those little things and you're calculating it to the cent. Okay. It's going to throw off all of the numbers. Now, the number on top, the purchase price, and the number on the very bottom, purchase price total, should be the same. If this number here does not match this number here, then your arithmetic is off. Somewhere in here is off. Okay. And it says that the balance of the down payment to bring to the table is 195,500, meaning that this plus your initial deposit, 34,500, should add 20% of the down payment. Does that make sense? Okay, so this number and the balance of the loan amount will bring the balance down, what the buyer has to wire into escrow to get this deal done. Okay, now this number can also change, right? You can put more. If the buyer is putting 50% down, right, then you do the calculations. But that's ultimately the simplest way of doing this. Interest rates, points, you don't have to, but these are little loopholes that if the buyer needs to back out of the deal, then you can put not to exceed 7%. And if for whatever reason the market crashes and the rates go up and it exceeds that 7%, that's a buyout for the buyer, meaning the buyer can back out because they were anticipating a 7% or less interest rate. If the rate is higher than 7%, the buyer may not want that bigger payment, or more so, they may not qualify. So that's kind of a strategy that I see agents put. Now, any solid listing agent will counter that and will put something that says that the buyer will get the most, the current prevailing rate, meaning whatever the rate is currently, the buyer is willing to accept. That could be over 7%. And if the buyer signs on that counter, then you're basically stuck if it's even over 7%. But if they don't counter and the rate eventually climbs and it goes in excess of 7%, then that gives the buyer an exit to cancel and retain their full deposit. Okay. Conventional on the right side, if checked. This is only if you have a FHA, VA loan, if you're doing seller financing or any other. Now, when it comes to cash, cash is cash, right? Hard money is not considered cash. It's private money, okay? You still got to get approved for it. So when agents put cash, it's not the right information. Hard money loans is not considered cash. They just eliminate a lot of the red tape involved when it comes to getting the process. They base the loan not on your personal, but on the property, on what we call the after repair value. What can we sell the property in the future once you renovate this home and make this house look pretty? So if it is a hard money loan, you're going to check other, and then you put here hard money finance. That's it. Okay, full transparency. Even though you may check cash, which you can, or you can release loan contingency as considered. We don't need a traditional way of doing this. We're going to go with a hard money loan. And that just tells the seller what your intentions are. But if it's not cash, ladies and gentlemen, meaning if the buyer does not have the $1,150,000 plus closing costs, is not considered all cash. Section E goes into any additional financing. Okay, if there's any additional financing involved, then that can be like a silent second. Maybe someone is lending you or gifting you money and they want to get paid on monthly fees or monthly payments. then you can add additional financing, first, second, third, whatever the case might be, then you would put this information there. Section E3 goes into occupancy type, what type of property. It's already defaulted as their primary. If this is not going to be their primary, then you need to check if it's a secondary home or an investment property. Simple. Questions? All right, let's continue to page 2. All right, page 2, you want to make sure that the property address up here and the date is all coincides. G1 talks about seller credit to the buyer. If the buyer is in desperate need that they want any concessions off the bat, then you're going to check this box here and say, I need X amount of money. If the buyer does not need additional money to close, then you leave it blank because the buyer is not asking for any additional closing costs. But if it's one of those situations where they need that extra income, but they want to buy a property, and the seller is willing, because the seller is the one ultimately gifting that money in good faith, then you're going to put that amount. Usually it's a percentage of the loan amount or the purchase price that they bring to the table. I know from personal experience that, many years ago, I did that. I would try to see if I can leverage the seller and go in with basically no money down. So you could, if the seller is willing to do so. Well, Simon, how do you do a deal with no money down and no closing costs? Well, have the seller pay for all of that. You go with an FHA loan, 3.5% plus an additional maybe a 1.5% for a total of maybe 4.5% to 5%. If the seller has enough equity on the property and is willing to relinquish the property because they don't need all of the money and are willing to have the buyer, then yeah, you can ultimately get the seller to pay all of your cost. Far and few, especially if the property is hot and it's competitive in multiple offers, you're probably not going to get your offer accepted. But what if a property has been sitting on the market for 4, 6, 7 months and the seller is getting desperate? And, at this point is they rather dump the property, give concessions, and be done instead of making constant monthly payments, right? So depending, these are again for your low tier FHA, VA loans that, you might be able to navigate this. On a conventional loan or cash deal, it's going to be hard for you, right? But I'm just giving you kind of an illustration that you can also put that. If there's any additional seller credit terms, then you can add it here. It does not include compensation to the broker, right? It's just if there's any additional terms that you're adding. Now, G3 is the most important in all. It's how we get paid. Okay, G3 is the most important paragraph, in my opinion, of everything. Without compensation, I'm not going to do any work. So here is the seller payment to compensate buyer or broker. This is what you're asking the seller to pay you for services rendered to represent a buyer and help the buyer get to the finish line. Seller agrees to pay the buyer broker out of transaction the proceeds. That amount is all negotiable. All negotiable. Okay. So the amount I put is 3% because I know I'm worth 3% or more. Okay. I know my knowledge, I know my understanding, and I know my worth. So I'm going to try to push for the maximum that I can and see where it lands. They may come back and says, I can't do 3, but I'll do 2.5. I'll do 2 and 2 quarters. I'll do 2%, right? It's all negotiable, but you want to start strong and then work from there. You can also ask for a flat fee as well. So if you don't want to do a percentage, you can always do a flat fee. Hey, I'm willing to take 15,000, even though the 3% may be 28 or 30,000. You may be okay with 15,000 because you want to get this deal. It may be a family, it may be someone that you know, and you're helping as well with some of the concessions, or you just want to get the offer down and you want to reduce your compensation so the seller nets more money. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Section H, 1 and 2 and 3 go into the verification of financing, right? First is verification of all cash. So it says that within 3 days after acceptance. Does that mean business days or does that mean calendar days? Calendar days, yeah. If it's in business days, then that was your answer. But you're right. It says 3 days. So my assumption is that it is 3 calendar days. Okay, so the verification. So if you're going with an all cash offer, I need to know within 3 days, right? Here, prove that you have the cash. How do you show proof? Well, bank statements, yeah, portfolio of investments that you have. Any of those will utilize for the benefit of providing verification that you have the means to close this deal. Verification of down payment and closing costs, right? Again, it says 3 days. Okay. Verification of loan application attached to the offer 3 days. Now, on that section, it says what type of qualification? Is it a pre-qualification? Is it a pre-approval? Or is it a full underwritten pre-approval? Meaning it's already gone through the underwriter, they've already approved it, we identified the property, they've submitted all of their financials, bank statements, paid stubs, tax paperwork, and it's been already gone up through the underwriter and they've already approved it. Now it's just going through the motions of getting the deal closed, right? The pre-qualification is basically, hey, I'm thinking about buying. They run a quick credit check. Your FICO scores are good. Your income is good, but they haven't really submitted everything. You always want to get the pre-approval, right? Because that means that the buyer has already gone through the trenches to start the initial process. Okay. Pre-qualification is just the base surface. The pre-approval is they've already submitted everything to the lender, and now they got an approval based on that. All right. Section J, K, and all of L's in Lincoln goes into the additional contingencies now. Now we're going to go into what are the contingencies? These are the safe haven uh, um, what I call walls. These are walls that protect the buyer's earnest deposit. And what I mean by walls, ladies and gentlemen, is consider this as your deposit. Okay. This is the $35,000 deposit. Okay. Now, right now, in the beginning, it's protected. The seller cannot just go and say, cancel, I want to get their deposit. Okay. The contingencies are what we call walls, walls that protect this deposit. You got 1 wall, 2 walls, 3 walls, 4 walls, whatever walls you have, the seller is on this side. The buyer's deposit is here with these walls as an illustration. Every wall that you release allows the seller to come in closer and closer and closer and closer to your client's deposit. The minute that the buyer releases any and all contingencies, all of the walls, that exposes the buyer's deposit. Now, it doesn't mean that the buyer's deposit is still in jeopardy, because if the buyer performs and closes the deal, then we're good. That money goes towards the closing costs and down payment to qualify for the loan. But if the buyer doesn't perform, forfeits, cancels, defaults, then the seller may have rights to the deposit. Does that make sense? Okay. So our job is to protect the buyer's deposit by making sure you're within contractual obligations to protect the buyer's deposit. Now, there's going to be a point in time that you're going to have to release all of the conditions, because if the buyer doesn't, then what happens is the seller has every right to send you what's called a notice to perform. And if that notice to perform is given to you, now the time starts ticking. You have 48 hours from that notice to perform to get the buyer to perform, to release those conditions, or the seller has the right to cancel. Okay. If you work so hard to get to almost the finish line, you need to make sure that the buyer understands their position, because they may either lose the deposit or lose the house, or they may lose both, right? So this contingency section here goes into what that illustrates or what it means. Section J is in Jack goes into the final verification of condition. That's already defaulted 5 days prior to close of escrow. So that means that the buyer, within 5 days of closing, so if we know that the 30th is the day of closing, when can the buyer do their final verification? 5 days prior. So the 25th, the 26th, the 27th, the 28th, and the 29th should be the time to do it. You don't want to do it the same day you're going to be closing. You want to give yourself that buffer, right? Because if there's any concerns or any issues with the property, right, that'll give you time to say, wait, we have an issue. We're going to have to delay the closing. We need to extend it, right? Many things can happen. So the final verification allows 5 days. K goes into assignment request. Now, properties can be assigned to your personal trust, your personal corporation, S Corp, C Corp, or your own limited liability company, your LLCs. That is perfectly allowed to do so. You have 17 days from acceptance to allow to transfer it to your trust or your corporation. Now, it also states and stipulates that you cannot assign it to any other person. It has to be agreed upon by the seller, meaning that if I buy it and hold this property, and then I change my mind and I want to assign it to, say, Jim back there, Jim Provencio, I need to get the seller's written permission to be able to hand it off to the buyer, which is buyer number 2, Jim, because I'm pulling myself out and Jim is putting himself into it. That's considered an assignment. Now, if the seller has no problem with that because they just want to close this deal, then we just need to get the written permission from the seller to allow the assignment to be transferred to a new person. Then you still have 17 days to do this. After 17 days, you have to release that as part of the condition. Questions? Okay. All right, contingencies. These are the times to remove the contingencies. This is what I was saying about the walls and protecting your buyer's deposit. You have 17 days to release the loan. You have 17 days to release the appraisal. Now, on there, I checked and I put 1,100,000. This is in case if you have some concerns regarding the value of the property, meaning that you don't think that the 1,150,000 may be able to be appraised, right? And you have some hesitations, but you want to still continue this, or your buyer wants to continue because they want the property. So this is considered a little bit of a buffer, if you want to say, meaning that the buyer will still buy the property even though it's less than what you submitted an offer on. Does that make sense? So whatever that amount is, you got to put it. The amount that you're willing to pay and the amount that you're also willing to pay if the appraisal does not come in to the 1,150,000. In this case, I put 1,100,000. So what is the buffer here?
50,000.
$50,000. Yeah. So if the property appraises between 1,150 and 1,1, the buyer will come in with the difference. The 50,000, the 30,000, the 40,000, they will come in. If the property appraises for less than 1,100,000, let's say it appraises for 1,075,000. That's below the threshold, meaning that now we can do 3 things. The buyer can now ask to drop it down to the 1,075,000. They can negotiate those terms. The seller can say, look, you know what? The appraiser came in. I'm good. We'll go ahead and reduce it. Or both mutually agree to not and cancel the transaction. So the buyer can submit a request to reduce it. The seller can accept and get the lower appraised value, or both can mutually cancel. All right. Does that make sense? Okay. Most people don't. They'll just leave it blank and gamble and hope that it appraises for the 1,150,000, right? But if the buyer wants it and they know, or the listing agent may even say, look, I don't know if it's going to appraise, but we got 30 offers. Your client wants it. They're going to have to come up with the difference. And that might be the deal breaker, because the buyer truly, truly wants to move into this neighborhood. They may just say, I'm okay paying the difference. And I've seen buyers pay in excess to 1 to 2 to 300,000 above the appraised value.
Does
It's-
the they'll have to come out with the cash to pay for that difference? Because
Yeah.
the bank not going to approve that, right?
Yeah, they're going to have to come in with the difference. So that's an additional to the 20%. That's an additional to the closing cost. That's all of that plus an additional $50,000 in this
The banks
case.
are going to stick to the appraisal.
Yeah, so the lenders will stick to the appraisal. So if the appraisal comes in from 1,150,000 down to 1,100,000, they're going to base that from the 1,100,000 20%, so that 920 may be 900,000. So you still have, because you're putting such a substantial amount of down payment, they might still be able to incorporate it where you don't have to come in with the difference, right? Or they may say you still may have to come in the difference. That's more like your FHA loans, where you're putting a little bit less down payment. They may ask you to come in with the difference. When you put substantial amount of down payment and your loan amount is a lot less than what you're actually paying for in the difference, they may just eat it and incorporate it into the to the loan because you're putting such a big down payment. There's really no risk to the lender because it's always a risk, right? If you default on the loan and they now have to foreclose, they want to make sure they can retain their amount that they lend you. So that's why the more down payment, the easier it is for the buyer to say, yeah, not a problem. We can eat it. We can incorporate it, or you can add the additional down payment to make it work. Good point. All right, next is the letter L3 goes into investigation of properties. Okay. That's the buyer has their due diligence to do any and all inspections on the property. Information access to the property 17 days. That means that even though they're releasing certain contingencies, they still have the right to do an inspection of the property. Oops, what happened here? Sorry. Let me go back again and share. Sorry, people on Zoom. Everything was working nice and perfect, and then we had to mess it up, right? 1 second here. I think it just reset everything, so let's go back again. I guess it has a timer, and then after a while, the timer goes off, so. I should have just done the PDF. All right, so let's go back momentarily. People on Zoom, can you see my screen?
Yes, can see it.
Okay, thank you. Okay. All right, so here we go. We're back in action. Let's go back to that section. Okay, so information access to the property, that means that, the buyer, even though they release this as part of the condition, this is more like your investors and all. The buyer still has the right to do any access to the property. It's not where they can force you say, no, you cannot. You release that as a condition. We're not going to give you access to the property. No, it says buyer right to access the property for informational purposes. It's not a contingency, does not create cancellation rights, and applies even if the contingency is removed, meaning the buyer still has 17 days to do whatever they need. If they need to get their contractor, they want to get anyone in there to get an evaluation of the property, they have that time frame. Now, you see all these blanks too. You can modify them, right? It's defaulted at 17 days, but it also says that you can go more than 17 days or less than 17 days. Okay. So again, these are all of the disclosures, seller's review of the documents, the preliminary title report, common interest disclosures, review of lease or liens, such as, solar panels and all that. It all falls at 17 days. If the buyer is selling their property, then you have to disclose under the COP that the buyer is contingent that they have to sell their property in order to get the proceeds to transfer the money to the escrow that you're currently in on this property. If there is no contingency COP, then you leave it blank. But if they need to sell their property in order to qualify, then you have to disclose that to the seller. Section M goes in time of possession. This is already defaulted that at time of recording at 6 p.m., you're going to hand over the keys to the buyer. Now you can modify that, but at the time of recording, so if it records today, then at 6 p.m. you have to provide the keys to the client, to the buyer. Okay, but you can also modify that as well. Seller occupying or vacant unit. This is only if the seller is planning to stay on the property after close of escrow. And this is, again, a dialogue and conversation you had with the seller or the listing agent that the seller is going to stay there longer. Then this is where the SIP form, or if it's going to be more than 29 days, then you've got to use what's called the RLA S form, right? The residential lease agreement. Most clients like to stay because of convenience. They're not rushed to vacate because there's uncertainty if we're going to close on time. So they always ask, give us another few days to vacate, right? Or maybe over the weekend and we'll be out by Monday, right? The SIP basically allows the seller to stay in addition to the time after the deal closes, when the exchange of ownership has already happened. We're just putting a disclosure that the seller is allowed to stay there after the close of escrow. If the property is occupied by tenants, then the TOPA form has to be included. If your client is buying an investment property, but they're planning to vacate after, then you would use this form. Next, the N1 through 5 goes into the seller's deliverance of documentations, signature of escrow, 5 days, time for HOAs if there's any HOA. So everything is already defaulted, but you also have these blank sections to modify, add, or reduce. Okay. The next is the items included on the property. What is staying, what is not staying? Okay, is the stove staying, the fridge, dishwasher, microwave. The next is the allocation of cost, folks. Okay, this is where the kind of the understanding of what the buyer and the seller are going to take care of. Here, it already, just for common practice, the natural hazard disclosure is always paid by the seller. You can provide who the company is or say seller's choice. If the property is under the wildfire area, then you would check this area and put, but if it's not, then you leave it blank. Government rental required point of sales inspection reports. That means if the city requires a pre-inspection, then you would say who's going to pay for those reports. If there's any corrections regarding the point of sale, who is going to remedy or correct those? Is it the buyer or the seller? In this case, we always put it at the seller. Escrow, usually each to pay their own fees. The buyer usually pays a little bit more. So if I'm a seller, I'm not going to pay it 50-50 because I've seen it in the past, each to pay 50-50. No, the buyer pays more fees than the seller. So I want to say each to pay their own fees separately. Owner's title, seller usually pays. County, city fees, seller usually pays. If you're asking for a home warranty, then you're going to put here, and you could put, what home warranty company you're choosing. If the property has HOAs in a condominium townhome, then you would include who's going to be paying for those transfer fees. If there's any additional terms and conditions, then you can add the additional language in here to be more specific. If there's something specific that you're requesting, then you add it here. If you're an agent and you represent yourself as a principal in the purchase of your home, you have to disclose to all consumers that you're licensed by the state of California in the capacity of a buyer. You would disclose that by divulging that you are also the buyer and the agent. The next is the advisory. It's pretty self-explanatory. If you know that the property is in a probate manufacturer home, if it tenants in common, which is very far and few, if there's any backup addendums, then you would check the appropriate box. Section 5 goes into kind of the language, which is pretty self-explanatory. And I think I kind of gave you the logistics of how the deposit is protected and ultimately can be forfeited if the buyer breaches the contract. Now, the listing agent cannot make the deposit non-refundable. They cannot just say the deposit is non-refundable. No, the buyer has the rights to do their due diligence, do their contingency removals, and then release the CR form in order for the seller to ultimately go after damages and the earnest deposit. So it already says that the deposit cannot be non-refundable. If you ever see in commercial, that's a common practice. Deposit is non-refundable, and it's okay because there's no specific language to it. On the RPA, it doesn't allow you to do that. You cannot make a seller put language that says that you submit an offer and you back out regardless. If you release your contingencies, you cannot say that it's non-refundable. Okay. Certain conditions when it comes to probate, but the probate does have languages about non-refundable deposit, but they also give you still a threshold time to do so. The next is basically kind of the stuff that we already discussed, the loan amount, the balances, the limits of credits, verification of down payment. It's pretty self-explanatory. On the grid, it just references all of this stuff, right? We talked about the occupancy, if it's a TOPA or an SIP, condition of the property of closed escrow. All properties are sold in as is condition. So when someone says on the counteroffer, property sold as is condition, you can always reference them and say, go to 7B. It already has as is in present physical condition, meaning all properties are as is. So there's no need to add the additional language on there. It's already as is condition, meaning this is a property that is not spanking brand new. It's going to have some problems. So it's already disclosed on there. Seller remains in possession after close of escrow. Again, if it's one of those deals where you're working with the seller, they're going to stay in possession. Then it just kind of illustrates the do's and don'ts and the responsibility. If something gets damaged, the seller is still responsible to cure it and fix it. Otherwise, the buyer has every right to sue the seller for damages. Contingencies we talked about, loan appraisal. We already talked about all that. Investigations, we talked about insurance. These are all of the conditions that the buyer and the seller have to understand in order to move the needle forward is what needs to happen. Otherwise, the seller has every right to cancel if the buyer does not perform. Section 6 here talks about leases. If it's solar panels, if there is water softeners that are still leased, you got to do the exchange. The seller has to provide all of the information, and the exchange has to be done with no issues or whatsoever, or the seller will have to pay off the amount off. So that way the buyer has a free and clear solar panels or whatever they have as a lease. Allocation of costs, we talked about it again, all of the stuff, part of the process is that, the buyer has every right to do their due diligence and also request the repairs and submit requests to the seller asking Mr. Mrs. Buyer, excuse me, Mr. Mrs. Seller, can you please fix this, credit this, or do a price reduction? And it's now negotiations. As I mentioned, you do negotiations in the beginning, you do the negotiations in the middle, and heck, you may also be doing negotiations towards the very end of the transaction. That's the beautiful thing about real estate. Inspections and all that, who is responsible? If the buyer is doing any additional re-inspections, then it's the buyer's responsibility to pay any additional re-inspection fees. Warranty, we talked about. Statutory disclosures like your NHDs, your lead-based paints, your TDS, your SPQs. Again, we'll go into greater details in future classes so that way you get an understanding of all the disclosures. Lead-based paints, as I stated, systems of inspections and disclosures, termination of rights. Remember, all offers are subject to cancellation if the buyer doesn't feel that this property is the right fit, right? They can submit an offer, the offer gets accepted, and they walk in and they realize after doing a home inspection, there's just a lot of work to be done. They have the right to exercise under paragraph 14B to cancel and retain their full deposit. Taxes withheld as part of it, there's buyer taxes, seller taxes, Megan's Law. The Megan's Law database for sex offenders, they provide you with the website. So if your clients are curious to know if there's any sex offenders anywhere in the neighborhood, this is the website that they can go. Hazards and liquids, because we live in Southern California, there's a lot of pipes, a lot of gases. It's just, hey, they can't come back to us and say, hey, you didn't tell me. We're disclosing to do your due diligence. Okay, so the condominiums and all that, solar panels, systems, balconies, no material facts, sellers within a specific time, if something they know or something happens during escrow, they have to let the buyer know, hey, you know what, we just had a electrical shortage in the electrical box. We're just disclosing that, right? Now, obviously, it's about negotiations. Sellers should do the right thing and get it fixed, but they also have to disclose if there's any new material facts that they were not aware, and now they have to bring it up to the buyer. The buyer has every right to do their inspections under paragraph 12. Title vestings, making sure that, the buyer does their due diligence and how they want to retain title, so they can do it as joint tenancies, tenants in commons. They can do as a corporation, so on and so forth. The condition of title. Remember, all properties have to clear title before transfer of ownership happens. Because if there's a cloud, the lender will not lend on the property. Sellers deliver information, deed, investment, all of it, title, insurance. Obviously, the bank is going to request. Section 14B is about the contingency removal, that the buyer has every right within the contractual period of 17 days to do all inspections: roof, title, electrical, foundation, landscaping, plumbing, anything and all. Check with the city for any inspections. And if they find something that just doesn't feel right, they have the right to exit and cancel and retain their full deposit. Seller's right to cancel. The seller also has the right. If the buyer's not performing, they're going radio silence, they're not responding on a timely manner, the notice to perform is sent. And if they don't sign and release certain conditions, then the seller has every right to cancel and now put the property back on the market and ultimately find a new buyer. Buyers have the same rights too. If the seller does not perform, they're making it very difficult. And, we keep pressing, and they still don't perform, then the buyer can send the seller a notice to perform. And if they don't perform, the buyer has every right to cancel and ultimately retain their full deposit. So this section just talks about the process, the procedures, the effects of the cancellation, how the money is awarded. If the seller makes it very difficult, doesn't want to release the money, then they can be involved in a civil penalty up to $1,000 for refusing to sign the cancellation, right? So these are, again, protections that protect all parties. Request the repairs, we talked. The buyer has every right to do inspections. Final walkthrough, we talked about that the buyer has 5 days before close of escrow to do their final walkthrough. Compensation, we talked about commissions and how that works. Joint escrow, we talked about that the escrow is in alignment with the purchase agreement and how escrow works. Copies and statements of information. All clients get copies of everything that they sign. You must get copies of everything, all paperwork. That is their file, that is their signature. So therefore, they're obligated to have all of this, and also the seller as well. Deliver of any additional amendments, copies of everything. Multiple listing service, obviously the property, if it is on the MLS, what is required, not required. If the buyer is requesting photos to be removed prior to close of escrow, then that can be a granted that the seller releases all of the photos, but leaves just one photo on the MLS. Attorney fees regarding a dispute arises that both the buyer and the seller should be able to collect reasonable attorney fees for the non-prevailing person, meaning if I win and you lose, I might be able to retain additional compensation for attorney fees that I incur. I can get it from either the buyer or the seller. Legal authorization, making sure that the buyers are legally capable, right? They're at the age of 18 or older, and that they have a sound mind. They know what they're doing. They're not in a position where there's, memory loss or it has to be the legal authorization person. So if they have the capacity to do so, then we should be good. Definitions, I would encourage all of you to look at the definitions instructions, because that gives you all of the meat and potato of what an acceptance means: an agent, an agreement, as is, authorized agent, all of the forms, close of escrow. I encourage you to go into this, because I get a lot of confusion when it comes to counting days. When can we release contingencies if it falls on a weekend or holiday? And again, we'll go deeper into it on a later date just for the sake of time. Deliverance means basically that when I deliver an email or hard copies, that is the deliver or delivered or deliverance of a form, right? So you got to make sure that any of the documentations within the time specified that you are providing all of the documents that they've signed and initialed. All of the jargon here about the laws, legal actions, and again, the time sensitives that this contract in its entirety is based on protecting all parties. And the last is the liquidated damage provision. Remember that the buyer is putting some skin in the game, up to 3% of the purchase price. If the buyer within their contractual position have every right to cancel and retain their full deposit. But if the buyer releases all contingencies, decides to cancel, the seller may go up to 3% of the damages to retain from the buyer's default. Mediation, if there's not a mutual agreement, I'm actually going to be going on a mediation on a dispute commission, on a cancellation, I should say. So I'm just waiting for the California Association of Realtors to provide me a date and time for this mediation. Hopefully it's not between the times that I'm going to be going to family reunion, but sometimes there's not a meeting of the mind and we have to do a mediation. If a mediation does not become successful, then the buyer and the seller have the right to arbitrate a dispute, escalate it into an arbitration. I would encourage you to read all this information, and really it's just the nuts and bolts that it's kind of going into a court hearing, meaning that the court, we're not going into court, but there's an arbitrator that would hear both sides of the story. And you have the right to do an opening statement, a cross-examination of any witnesses, and then you do your what's called the final statement of what you want to provide to the arbitrator to plead your case on why you believe you should be the winning party, right? And the opposing party also has that ability too. Thing here is it's up to the arbitrator. Within 20 to 48 hours, you'll receive a letter or an email saying who is the winning party. So if it's a if it's a deposit dispute and it's an escrow and the seller retains the right to that deposit, that form that we receive from the arbitrator, we just take it to escrow and then escrow can release the money to the seller. Okay, so you again, when it comes to an arbitration, it's kind of the top tier of disputes. You want to try to do a mediation, and if there's no resolution from a mediation is just negotiating. Okay, you want your deposit, the seller wants your deposit. Are you willing to meet somewhere in the middle? Are you willing to release some and keep some? It's just back and forth mediation. But if we're firm and stern and nope, I'm not going to release, and you spend 6-8 hours and you still don't come to a resolution, then the mediator is going to say, no, we cannot continue. It's just both are stern and firm in their position, and therefore then the next step would be is to arbitrate it. Okay. Offer and expirations, we talked about 3 days. It also says if you are representing on the capacity of an entity, then you would check here entity buyer. If it's a trust, corporation, LLC, probate, partnership, then you need to know who the person that's going to be signing on behalf of that entity. Contractual identity of buyers, basically, if it's John Smith, or like it says John Doe co-trust, John Day co-trust, revocable family trust, and that's how it's going to be put in on the offer. Then the buyer signs, and if there is any counter offers, if the seller accepts, then they're going to sign. But if there's a counter offer, they would check that there's subject to the SCO or the SMCO, and then they would check this, or if they're basically going to accept you as a backup offer. And then the rest is for the escrow instructions, all of the information attached for escrow, so that way they can start the paperwork and get the ball rolling. The acknowledgement is right here for the escrow. If your offer is not accepted, then the seller can initial and say that your offer unfortunately was rejected. You can also say that the offer was presented, and the seller agent or the sellers can sign here. And that pretty much wraps up the purchase agreement. Any questions, thoughts, or concerns? I know it was a lot of information, and please feel free to reach out to me. We can do a deep dive if you have any specific questions that I can answer. But with that, that concludes today's class. Any final questions before we close it out?